Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really important event. And I'm absolutely delighted that I get to talk about the Australian story and our advocacy success. And we are still celebrating that success. But I think there are so many learnings from what we did. And hopefully this will be really relevant and plant some really great ideas on how what happened in Australia can perhaps now happen in New Zealand. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where I'm coming from. I am in beautiful, beautiful Wurundjeri land, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So yes, I am from Diabetes Australia. I live with type 1 diabetes. I call myself a diabetes advocate and activist. I'm a health writer, a researcher, and I am part droid. I've been wearing an insulin pump now for about 22 years, and I have been wearing CGM since it was launched in Australia well over 10 years ago. It is actually close to 15 years ago that we first saw CGM in Australia. Now, I'm going to ask a question. Who keeps hearing CGM being referred to as emerging technology? I really need everyone to stop doing it. This is not new technology. Sure, there have been new generations and new iterations and really brilliant new technologies that have come in and augmented what was already there. But CGM has been around for ages now. So no more calling it new, no more calling it emerging. But we should be talking about how we can make sure that everybody who can benefit from it can access it. So let's have some fun and talk about what we did in Australia to make that a reality for people with type 1 diabetes. So let's move on. Okay, so the truth about advocacy that nobody wants to tell you, it is a slow burn. So I think we love the idea that we will get out there, make a bit of noise, and then change happens. And actually, a lot of people think that that's exactly how this happened. That back in 2017, when Australia first got a taste of some subsidised access to CGM, that there had been quite a bit of noise the previous year, and then voila, look at us, we've got some funding. That's not how it happened. I can remember being in the room when CGM was first launched into Australia, and a number of people were saying, right, this is incredible technology. How do we get this into the hands, onto the stomachs, onto the arms of people with diabetes? At the time, I was very fortunate to be spending a lot of time with people from international diabetes communities, especially in the US. And CGM was really common, or far more common there than it was in Australia in terms of people actually being able to afford it. So how did we make that happen? But it's been close to 15 years. It does take time. And I think that that's the thing that we need to remember, that if we're expecting a quick fix, that's sadly just not the way that works. And the truth about advocacy for us was that we had the eye on the prize the whole time. And that is really hard to do and to maintain, especially when it is that slow burn, when you're putting in so much time and you're waiting and waiting and nothing seems to be happening. But every step of the way, something is happening. But keeping your eye on the prize is really important. And that prize was CGM for all. Now, I'm going to be really clear. And when I say CGM for all, I mean CGM for all people with type 1 diabetes. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, about why we need to broaden that. But when we started almost 15 years ago, it was CGM for all people with type 1 diabetes, because that's what the evidence was. That's who was using the technology. That's very much who it had been created for. And so our whole focus was on getting CGM for people with type 1 diabetes. Now, we did have CGM for all in our mind, but we also knew that we needed to be smart about it, because if we walked in and said, we want this for everyone and we want it now, we would be laughed out of a room. And so that was something that we also learnt about. And we also learned that we had to tell the story. We had to tell the story about why. It was always about the why. Why was this technology so important? And why did people need this? And the reason that we had to be able to do that in a way where we were really confident about it was because we were talking to largely policymakers who don't really know diabetes. So when you say to them, there's this device and it monitors glucose levels, they'll say, but we already have those and they're already subsidized and they work fine. So being able to really tell a very compelling story about what it was that this technology did that earlier technologies didn't do was really critical. And that's where storytelling is so, so important. And that's why hearing lived experience and people with diabetes tell their stories about what it was that that they hope this technology would do. For those who are lucky enough to be able to use it, who are self-funding, for them to talk about how much it had changed things, that was really important. And that was the why that we needed to keep coming back to. And this is what we kept coming back to. It was things like this, 180. Now, this is a number that keeps getting thrown around, 180. That's the number of decisions, diabetes-related decisions that people with diabetes make every day. Now, look, I'm going to be really honest when I say this. This is one of those numbers that it was written about in a blog post from Stanford University, and it has become gospel. Is there a source for this? I don't know. I really don't. But that's actually not what the important thing is here. What the important thing is telling the story of the burden that people with diabetes have every single day managing this condition. Now, whether it's 120, 180, or 300 diabetes-related decisions that we have to make every single day, trying to work out how we can reduce that and make diabetes easier has to be the front of mind of everybody working in the diabetes space and people living with diabetes as well. Of course, we want to be doing less. Of course, we want it to be less burdensome. So let's use this number 180 because it's a nice round number. It's nice and neat and people seem to recognize it. But understand that what it is that we're saying is how can we make it so that people with diabetes don't have to do so much diabetes every day? Now, just remember, these are things on top of everyday decisions that people without diabetes have to make, right? So what am I going to wear today? What am I going to have for breakfast today? Will I have that second latte? The answer is always yes. Whatever it might be, there are lots of decisions that everybody makes. People with diabetes make a significant number of extra decisions. And that's what we wanted to work out. How can we make it so that there are fewer decisions? And we knew that CGM was one way that we could certainly do that. So how can we help this situation? Now, this image here is an absolute cracker that I use any opportunity I possibly can. The blue circle, of course, is the blue circle of diabetes. And you will see there is a tiny little white sliver that has been cut out of that circle. This was created by an incredible diabetes advocate called Manny Hernandez, who originally was from Venezuela. He lives in the US. Manny is one of the first real global diabetes advocates I was ever fortunate enough to meet online first and then in real life. And he's continuing to be just such a powerful force in the diabetes advocate space. But what this image shows is that that tiny sliver that's cut out, that's how much time every year people with diabetes have with healthcare professionals. And the rest of the time, we are doing this on our own. So again, that's where those 180 decisions fit in. That's a lot of time that people with diabetes are doing diabetes, that we're responsible for it. For little kids, it's their parents who are carrying that burden. So what is it that we can do to help that situation? What is it that we can do that in all that time where we're not with health professionals, where diabetes is all on us, how can we make it so that it's just a little bit easier? And that was a story that we really needed to sell when we were trying to have policymakers understand why it was important that they get on board and help us to find a way to subsidize this technology for people with diabetes. And we had to do that by winning hearts and minds. And this has become sort of like a motto of mine in recent times. Now, we know that we can put up researchers and clinicians, and they can talk about the research, they can talk about the data, they can talk about the numbers, they can talk about the surveys, the studies, they can stand up at health professional conferences and talk about how incredible this technology is. And they are absolutely right. And that's all the mind stuff, and that's really important. And we can put people with diabetes up there and they can talk about how meaningful their life, this technology has been in changing their lives, how much it has made them feel safer, how much it means that how much better they sleep. For parents, how much, more their kids are able to participate in daily school activities because the parents feel confident that they can do that. Whatever it is, we can put up lots of people with diabetes to tell that story, and that's all the heart stuff. But you know where it becomes really, really powerful is when we put them together, hearts and minds. Suddenly it's really difficult to go, no, we don't really believe you, because we're telling this whole very full story about why this technology, why this CGM technology is so critical. And this is something that we did in Australia as part of our campaign. You bet that we found all of the evidence and we kept updating it because there was always more and more evidence. But every step of the way, we made sure that there were people with diabetes telling their stories as well to add to that. And that's why we formed an alliance. And really, I know I should have some music from Star Wars playing right now, because we formed this incredibly powerful alliance of everybody to do with diabetes really in Australia. So we had Diabetes Australia, that's where I work. We brought in JDRF. Now that was the heart stuff, right? We are the organizations who are there representing people with diabetes. So we had lots of people with diabetes who work with us, who work for us, but also our community, our networks that we could go to and say, please let us share your stories. Stand up. We've got a platform for you to tell your stories. Let's get the heart stuff out. And then we had the Australian Diabetes Society with its endocrinologists and researchers. We had the ADEA, the Australian Diabetes Educators Association, and APEG, which is the Australian Pediatric Endocrine Group. And they took care of all the mind stuff. So they were the researchers, they were the clinicians, they could talk about that side of things. It makes it really difficult when you stand up in a room of politicians and you say, hey, this is why this should happen. Here's the evidence. And then you put up some kids or some young people or some older people to talk about how this technology has changed their lives for the better, how they have been able to participate more fully in their work, how they have missed fewer days at school, how they have needed fewer hospital admissions. All of these stories were able to be presented with the evidence to support it. Makes it really hard for people to ignore you, or it makes it really, really hard for people to go, we don't think actually that this is all that important. Now, that's not to say that it was smooth sailing. I can tell you that I was here's one we prepared earlier at one of our events. We had some absolutely brilliant researchers get up there and talk about how important CGM technology is, how it is the way of the future, but it's here now. And then I got up there and I spoke about how I was sleeping better, how it meant that I could travel for work, and that my husband wasn't all that stressed and worried about it anymore, that my parents weren't all that stressed and worried about it anymore. I talked about how I really wished that I'd had this technology when I'd been pregnant with my daughter, because it would have made things so much easier. Because at that time I had been testing with doing finger prick checks 25 times a day to get an idea of what my glucose levels were. And CGM would have meant that that didn't happen. CGM wasn't in Australia at that point in time. And I had a politician raise his hand and say to me, I just don't get it. We have here in Australia, we will fund blood glucose meters. Why should I be paying for a Mercedes if we will give you a Ford? And I just had this moment of such incredible discomfort, because the idea that we are equating life-saving and life-changing diabetes technologies to luxury motor vehicles was just absolutely appalling to me. Now, I had the CEO of Diabetes Australia standing next to me when that question was asked, and he had that look on his face, which was, oh gosh, what's Renza going to say? Because it could have gone either way. But I just simply said, that's just not the right way to look at it, because it's not a way, it's not something that you can compare. That's not the same thing. And this MP came up and had a chat with me afterwards and apologized for using a car analogy. I quite like car analogies. I think often that they work, but it was a really great opportunity to talk about how we need to move beyond thinking of this as a luxury. It's not a luxury. No one chooses to get diabetes, but everybody should be able to manage their diabetes using the devices and the tools that work for them. Not everybody is going to want to use a CGM, but for me, it was the best thing for me. And I did want to use it. I just didn't want to have to keep paying $400 every time I needed, $400 a month or whatever it was costing me. So this alliance was incredibly powerful. We formed this over a decade ago, and together we have fought the fight and kept going. We were always on the same page. Our messaging was the same. We were consistent with our approach, and that was really, really important. And we had a staged approach because we knew that that was also really important. It was a step-by-step approach. We knew that we couldn't simply say, fund this to every single person with type 1 diabetes right here, right now, even though that was our ultimate goal. That was the eye on the prize. That's where we were getting. But we knew that we simply couldn't do it. And we knew that we would not get any traction at all if we sat down and tried to get people on our side to come along with us and to make this happen. We had to do it step by step. We had to look at what the evidence was telling us. We had to talk about higher risk groups. We had to talk about exactly what it might look like in a way that would be palatable to decision makers early on and get our foot in the door. And this is the process of how that happened. We had CGM and flash access for people with type 1 diabetes. Now, this was something that we developed at Diabetes Australia back in March 2020, when we'd had, I guess, the third iteration of our funding. So in Australia, we have the National Diabetes Services Scheme, which provides diabetes. Part of the NDSS is to provide diabetes supplies at a subsidised rate to people with diabetes. So back in April 2017, that was, I guess, the first bite of the apple that we had. We had access, it was fully funded access to children and young people under 21 years old who met specific criteria. And there was criteria around that because it was based on clinical need. So that criteria was things like impaired glycemia awareness, fear of hypoglycemia, had been hospitalized because of hypoglycemia. So there were criteria that people needed to meet. In March 2019, with continued advocacy, that was expanded to women who were planning for and who were pregnant and immediately postpartum. And this was women with type 1 diabetes. And for children and adults up to 21 with conditions similar to type 1 diabetes as well. So that was also included. And then adults over 21 with concession card status, but also who had high clinical need. And there was an assessment process, if you like, to decide as to whether or not people would actually get that. It was a really challenging time, really. It was great because it did broaden access, but it didn't guarantee if you were over 21 and had a healthcare card that you would get it, because you did have to meet these very strict criteria. And then in March 2020, this was great at that point in time, because at that point in time, that clinical need, that high clinical need was removed. So it just meant that everybody up to the age of 21 was able to access it. And then over 21s with healthcare cards were also able to access it as well. Now, we weren't done at that point. We knew that at that point, about 50% of the type 1 diabetes population in Australia had access to subsidised CGM. And we were thrilled with that. And we did jump up and down and get a bit excited and, pop some party poppers. But we did that for about 5 minutes and then we went back to work. We absolutely weren't done. And that was really important for us to communicate that to the community, because there was still a lot of people who were not eligible, who was still needing to come up with $4,000 a year to fund their CGM. And I was one of those people. I didn't meet any of the other criteria. I was still needing to pay out of pocket. So these are just some, I love some photos. This is our stage 1, these gorgeous, gorgeous kids who were eligible after the first one. And look at them. They are just absolutely divine. There's 3 kids there from one family, all with type 1 diabetes. And, what an incredible day that was for their family. Stage 2, and there's a health minister with a baby, because don't they love that? And this was such a joyous, joyous occasion. It was just absolutely gorgeous. We had some women with diabetes who were either pregnant or had recently had bubs, and they were just so delighted that, they would be able to access this, for their current pregnancies and perhaps future pregnancies as well. So that was really wonderful. And here was stage 3, where we had people, all people who were over 21 with a healthcare card or a concession status, who were able to access CGM fully funded. So there was no copay. And that was just truly remarkable. It was life-changing for so many people. And then this year we had stage 4.1. And don't you love a federal election? Because back in April, about a month out from the election, I woke up on a Sunday morning. We knew that this was coming. Woke up on a Sunday morning, and there was the current Prime Minister and the Health Minister, all excited and they made a promise that from the 1st of July, they got back in. From the 1st of July, there would be CGM for all people with type 1 diabetes. And an hour later, the opposition, who were favoured to win the election the following month, came in and said, we'll match it. And that was a moment that was just truly incredible, because that was the moment that we knew that all people with type 1 diabetes were going to have access to CGM. Now, everybody was saying, how incredible, how have you managed to do this, to get parties on both sides of the aisle to agree? And this is something that we've been so fortunate about in Australia. That NDSS that I mentioned, that has always had bipartisan support. We have had incredible support. It didn't matter what side of the aisle, it didn't matter who was governing. We had incredible support for the NDSS and for diabetes. So it wasn't really all that much of a surprise. It was a huge relief. There were a lot of tears on that Sunday morning in my house, because that slow burn, those over 15 years, that was, you know, we were there almost. We still had to have an election, and then it actually had to become a reality. And that happened in July of this year. And this was the announcement, the big day. There's our new health minister in the middle, and then a collection of rabble-rousers from Diabetes Australia who were celebrating and so delighted. There are two of us there who had been in the trenches fighting this battle since it first started. And were we delighted? You bet we absolutely were. And every single step along the way, this is what it has been about the community. It has been by the community, for the community, with the community. And we could not have done what we did if it wasn't for people with diabetes standing up, telling their stories, writing letters to their local MPs, getting on social media and talking about things in their own networks, forming little alliances themselves, coming on board whenever we needed a crowd. They would be there to tell their story and talk about why it was so important. And the thing that was incredible was that each of those stages, when we had people who were ready and they'd already received that funding, they were already eligible, they didn't stop fighting for the people who hadn't quite got there yet. This was truly a community effort. And that's one of the things that is so powerful, is knowing that it is the whole community that is behind this and wanting it for everybody. So that, I think it's just really, really important that we do recognize and acknowledge just the driving force of people with diabetes, families affected by diabetes, and the emotional labor and often trauma that goes into telling stories about why having access to this sort of technology is important, and the sacrifices that families are making to make sure that before there were subsidies, that people could actually keep using these things. And we wanted it for everyone. That's what we've always said, for everyone. But we're not done yet. We're not done yet. You bet we have got CGM for all people with type 1 diabetes now. I should just add that the people who came on board, so people like me, on the 1st of July, we do have a copay, but it's at about 10% of what we were paying beforehand. It's under $400 a year now that we're paying for CGM, as compared with up to $4,000. We're not done yet, because we know there are people with type 2 diabetes on insulin who absolutely would benefit from CGM, and they should have access to it as well. We know that there are people over 21 who have other types of diabetes that behave in a similar way to type 1 diabetes. They have access until they're 21. Once they hit 21, they don't have access anymore. They need access as well. We are not done yet. And that is part of that advocacy focus, is that you got to keep remembering there is always going to be something else. And there are always going to be more people who will benefit. We come from this position of the right device for the right person at the right time, and we don't have that for all people yet. So we are not done yet. And then we will continue to keep fighting for every single person who needs access to this technology. There's more here. All over the Diabetes Australia website, you will hear about our staged approach and our successes. You'll be able to find all of our media releases there. Our Facebook page is just so beautifully littered with these stories of how we got there and the people who this has benefited. There are some links there as well to where you can find me on social media. I have a blog, and I have written a lot about this, about the power of advocacy, about the slow burn of advocacy, about advocacy burnout, because you bet that's real, and how we keep going. And you can always reach out and contact me. But that is the Australian story. We are delighted, but we do know that a lot of what we learnt and a lot of what has worked for us is absolutely going to be relevant for people elsewhere. And we are watching very, very closely to see what's going on in New Zealand. I'm very connected with a number of diabetes advocates from New Zealand who are truly remarkable. And when I talk about forces to be reckoned with, there are just some absolute fabulous monsters in this community who are continuing to do great things. And we want to stand side by side. And if there's anything that we can do to help, we will be there. We will wave flags. We will share what worked with us. And then we're going to celebrate when it happens, because it has to happen. It absolutely has to happen. Thank you.